Well, I know quite a few people here, so it feels like I'm at home. And I'd like this to develop into a dialogue. But I think what I have to say needs to be framed a little bit. I think I've been associated one way or another with the Centre for a long period of time. And I can't help but think of colleagues I've worked with over the years, Andrew Edwards, that some of you may remember, of course, Hazel Reed, as well as Anne. And I see Joe here, and I see all kinds of people, Barbara, all kinds of people I've worked with over the years. So it feels like a family conversation. And again, family conversation is often necessary and sometimes quite difficult. The second point I wanted to make by way of introduction was that the more I think about these things, the kind of work you do, and I don't know the specifics of the roles you take on and your struggles in the workplace, I'm very conscious of those. But the more I've thought about the kind of world in which we live, and its problems. I don't like to use the word challenges, but it keeps jumping into my head. So forgive me if I mention that. And social theorists and cultural theorists, sociologists have given a lot of thought to this kind of world. And I think I want to say that the metaphors that particular thinkers use, like Anthony Giddens, who's a sociologist, or Zygmunt Bauman, who's a very distinguished sociologist, have to do with things like runaway world, or have to do in Bauman's case with what he calls liquid dirt. And I think what is being communicated in my mind by, we can disagree as to how much the world has always had that degree of liquidity and uncertainty about it. But nonetheless, I think there's a consensus that we're not quite sure what's happening, not least to Korea. And I suppose in that kind of liquid or runaway world, and I like the metaphor or the example that Giddens uses, that the flick of a computer algorithm, whole communities can be de-skilled in a matter of seconds. Or the consequence, or the process begins in a matter of seconds that can undermine people's life worlds, their livelihood, their families, their communities. So it's a slightly scary world that we live in. And I want to put to you something that you may or may not have considered, that in such a world, it seems to me that the kind of work you do is guidance counselling, and I do understand the distinctions between some of these things, in mentoring or in counselling, become incredibly important. Because I suppose one dimension of a liquid world or the runaway world is that we need points of stability. We need people who will listen and help us to orientate ourselves in such a world. So I know that it might feel at times, might not, that your professional status or the work that you're doing is not necessarily universally valued. But I think I would want to underline from the very beginning that actually I think your work is of fundamental importance in the kind of world we have. I think I just like, I don't know, I use this violet, of course, at a conference, and it spoke to people a bit of time ago now, because it helps us to think of context. The viola is beautiful, but think about what goes into the cultivation and the expression of such beauty. We need to look after the soil. We need to work with the flower. It's not something that happens inevitably. In fact, in many places, unfortunately, there was no space, for whatever reason, for the violet to flower. And I think that's what I want to seek to illuminate this morning, that what makes things flower, or the word I'm going to use, is flourish. Because I think sometimes to get the right question in our professional work, in our doctorates, or whatever, is a huge ask. And to me, I think the question that motivates me in my work, and I draw on a range of thinkers, and we need thinkers, serious thinkers to help us, is what facilitates or inhibits human flourishing. Whether the flourishing is in our clients or whether the flourishing is in us as professionals, the divide between the professional and the personal has always been an interesting one. It's slightly problematic. And in the context of this conference, interprofessionality. So that's what I want to explore a little bit with you. Now this should go, shouldn't we know? Pourquoi non? Never my strong point. Anne said I should say a little bit about myself and what I do, and the rationale for inviting me this morning. Well, I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist as well as an academic. And I want to frame the process of becoming a human being or flourishing as a human being within a relational context. We're not isolated, solipsistic creatures. We are born into relationships. And relationships at an intimate level also are affected by the family context in which we are born, for better or for worse. There's a lovely phrase that's used by, or was used by the very distinguished psychoanalyst that some of you would have heard of, Donald Winnicott, about things not needing to be perfect, but good enough. So it's how we create the circumstances that are good enough. So that my focus is partly on the intimate, the intimate in my kind of psychoanalytic work gets translated into an inner dynamic. I mean, crudely, if a person is abused in a very intimate experience, that person can become an abuser in turn. It's as though the inter becomes intra subjective. And that's the kind of work I do. But it's not enough for me. Because I think if we're going to think about human flourishing, we need a broader frame of reference, which I'll come on to. I'm also a professor and a researcher. I'm a gatherer of people's stories. And it took me quite a while to find my way through the thing called research to, if you like, what I felt was authentic or good enough research. I call it auto/biographical narrative. It sounds a mouthful, but really it's quite simple, but very demanding and challenging in its application. Biography means, or this kind of approach means, that we try to understand the world as if we were standing in somebody else's shoes. Not through the frame of an organization or not through the frame of management imperatives, but as it is in someone's shoes. Often the biographical perspective, as is implied, will give us a lifelong view of someone's, I think that word by Mark Savickas, which I just came across again this morning, preoccupations. Preoccupations, which is a word, I think, a lovely notion it's worth thinking about. So that's biography. Auto is that when we engage in research, we are there. The conventional view is that we obliterate the subjectivity of the researcher in the interaction, but I see research like human flourishing as a relationship. And we have to think about our presence. I've worked with young mums in places like Margate or East London. And when I'm there as a researcher trying to understand what it's like to be in their shoes, I'm there, whether we like it or not. And to don a kind of metaphorical white coat is really pointless, because you have to build a good enough relationship to be able to understand, or for somebody else to be able to tell their story. And within stories, they're not simply unmediated representations of someone's experience. Stories are full of what's powerful, what we call in academic speak, the powerful discourses, or ways of thinking that percolate through a society. Think young mums in a place like Margate, how they come to disparage themselves, because in a sense, society disparages people on the margins. But also within the relationship of research, unconscious processes can be at work. You will be familiar with this because actually these processes are ubiquitous and will be there in your work as guidance, counselors, or whatever. Like the need to appease or please. If you lived on the margins and when in your encounters with authority, if it's not been wholly positive, you'll find a way of managing and giving the stories back that kind of keeps authorities at bay. And I chronicle that in a lot of detail in my own work. Narrative is obviously a reference to story. And in a way, that's been a big issue in my own work. How do we facilitate more open, less defended ways of storytelling and thinking about and working with people? And with Hazel Reid in particular, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the process of generating stories in more open, less defended ways, both within a research setting, but also within narrative careers guidance. I should say as well, and this, I suppose this is an expression of my values. I've done a lot of work in very marginalised communities. I suppose for a soundbite that has to do with struggles for social justice. So often working with very marginalised people in very difficult circumstances. I want to share with you 3 stories this morning, and I'd be interested in what in psycho-speak we call processes of projective identification. So how do the stories speak to you? Do they speak to part of you? Do you recognise bits of yourself in the stories that Zoe tells? Zoe, these are all pseudonyms, of course. Zoe is a guidance worker. Andrew, the priest, and Matthew, and how topical could this be? The migrant, struggling to find good enough relationships and spaces in the context of a particularly problematic community in London. Andrew the priest is set within this particular study, which I published a book last year called Distress in the City, and it's my home city, it's where I was born. Some of you may know it, you've probably heard of it, if only by the football team. It's Stoke-on-Trent, Stoke City that is, in the English Midlands, which has been a struggling city for quite a long time because of economic collapse and all the consequences that stem from that, including the rise of racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia, and I can think of nothing more topical than that, and a whole history. Some of you may know this. I started my academic career as a labor historian, as a historian of working class communities, that those traditions of working class self-help that grew out of the Industrial Revolution and were particularly strong in the 20th century have largely disintegrated. A colleague of mine, a sociologist, says that of all the processes of deindustrialization in the 20th century, the latter part of the 20th century, that fragility of working class self-help institutions has been a catastrophe for many communities. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that. So there's my question about human flourishing, which I'd like to kind of think aloud with you. And I want to say that I don't know what you think if somebody mentions theory. You probably want to run away. Theory has a strange place in the academy. I have students who say, God, it finds me stiff. I think, and again, it's Hazel who used this word, we need to find some theoretical friends. And I use the word friends deliberately, who can help us to understand the complexity of what it is that we're struggling with. I've mentioned one already, Donald Winnicott, who I think is talking at some basic level about love, or good enough love, in our relationships with significant others. A good enough love that makes it possible to be open, to take risks, to experiment. Because we're not preoccupied with looking after the prime caregiver. We're not anxious, we're not caught up in the management of something which doesn't feel quite right. And I've chronicled in some of my work with mature students in higher education, how it's not just about the intellect, it's about quite primitive processes of what I call recognition. You know that moment, we've all been there, where you struggle to say something in a seminar where you're not feeling comfortable, and the tutor says, the tutor might look through you, and you can leave a seminar and probably nearly leave the university course because you feel so miserable and inadequate. But there are moments which I think touch very primitive, or what we call early parts of who we are, where we feel a tutor recognizes us, makes us feel legitimate, doesn't ridicule, but celebrates. And in our own heads, we might think, oh, that's terrible. But that somebody's taking an interest in us, listening to us, coming alongside us non-judgmentally, encouraging us to develop a particular point. So Winnicott is one. The other is Axel Honneth. Now, don't be frightened. He's a German. He's a sociologist. It's heavy going. But I think his notion of recognition takes us from that intimate level to groups. And how we relate to people in groups. Now, within our lives, within our biographies, there would have been a range of groups to which we have belonged. Being here may be part of that. So students who are doing the course, I have no idea how many are doing the course, but also professionals will know in their own biographies that sometimes it's a bit like the university seminar, you know, where you feel, do I belong here? Is this a place where I'll feel welcome? Is this a place where I'll feel legitimate, where you gulp, where your throat is dry? And you wonder if what you say is going to be stupid. We've all known these things. They are human experiences. But then when somebody, like the tutor I mentioned, recognizes us, we can slowly begin to feel part of a group. We move from the periphery more to the center of things. And when our contributions begin to be valued, when we feel we are okay as a university student or a careers professional or whatever it might be, then Honneth uses the phrase self-respect. So we can think of the first more intimate level as selfhood. Honneth uses the term self-confidence. I don't entirely like. Self-respect. And then when we go on in our careers work or as students, to do something that the group actually feels very valuable for its continuation, for its well-being, for its health. This may be in a professional context, it may be in a student context. Then we begin to develop what he calls self-esteem. Crucially, in a society that's struggling in a multicultural way to work out how it should develop. What Honneth says, building on the work of someone called John Dewey, is that when we feel recognized ourselves, fully recognized and valuable, that we are better able to recognize the other. And in that context, social solidarities can be strengthened. So I think this is an incredibly important point. So let me take you into Zoe's story. Again, to stress, these names are pseudonyms, and you may be able to identify a little bit with Zoe. She found herself she worked in a marginalised community struggling with some of the processes I referred to in the context of Stoke, deindustrialisation, uncertainty, fragility in terms of people's careers. She was struggling with who she was and what she should be doing, and the way she gave expression to this was that Linden and Hazel, she would say, I don't know what I should be doing. I have people who come in here who are really quite needy and very, very uncertain. Some quite fragile. I don't want to overplay that because I think we can pathologise people, but nonetheless, quite fragile. But I'm told I have to follow a 12-point interview schedule. And I'm told I've got 10 minutes or whatever it is to do this. And the preoccupation is not with process or good enough relationship. The preoccupation is with outcomes. That I have to fit people into something. Square pegs into round holes, or whatever the phrase happens to be. And I scream sometimes, she said, at the absurdity of what it is that I'm doing. That I'm aware on the one hand, through my counselling, that the considerable needs of the person sitting opposite me. But on the other hand, I'm questioning at quite a substantial level the merits of what I'm doing. And by the way, I've heard similar things amongst other professionals. I've done work with doctors in difficult inner city contexts, and the 10-minute slot, and how absurd that can be when you're dealing with someone whose symptoms are complex, who challenge us to the core emotionally. There was a phrase that was used by another psychoanalyst, Michael Balint. Some of you may know of the Balint groups that were very important in supporting doctors for many years. They've climbed a little bit in more recent times. And he used the phrase, disturbance disturbs. So that when you're working with people who are disturbed, it'll have an effect on you, whether you like it or not, sometimes unconsciously, and we need to pay attention to that. Zoe was disturbed by some of what was happening. The picture on the top there is, of course, of Mark Savickas, whose work, I noticed somebody who's doing a workshop today and mentioned Mark Savickas in the blurb. I love the way he works. You may know or not know that Mark Savickas propounds the importance of narrative approaches in careers guidance and counselling. His background is as a psychoanalyst. And if you watch Mark Savickas working, there is a lovely containing feeling about how he relates to someone. And how can I help you today? Is the kind of question he would pose. And he would come at storytelling quite playfully. So, tell me your role model from TV or whatever. What's your favourite TV show or whatever? And you see from his work that the juices of storytelling, get going, flowing in a good enough relationship. What we decided to do some years ago now was to do a similar kind of, it's almost like a piece of action research with people in this part of the world, with careers guidance people or careers counsellors. I'm very aware of the issues around the terminology. To see whether in the real world, with people like Zoe, whether some kind of experiment in narrative-based approaches might be helpful to them. Zoe's experiences were mixed. I suppose that in a world that gets obsessed with what I call manualization, so here's your schedule, you have to do it according to that. In a way that can be seen, and I'm not saying I'm not wanting to dismiss it, but it can be seen as a way of managing difficulty. You're keeping things out of the frame of the relationship between someone else, with yourself and someone else. Zoe told a number of stories. So what various participants in the research did was we did role play. They learned how to or became more confident in facilitating storytelling. And then they went out and they recorded interactions with particular clients. And they then brought back those tapes and we talked about them in the group, and later on we did some more what I would call auto/biographical narrative research to chronicle the experience over a bit of time. I'm not going to pretend this is easy, but then the world we're living in isn't easy. And it's a question of how we manage this. So Zoe told a story she told various stories about people where it did work very well. But she told a story of quite a disturbed young woman who came into the session one day, and Zoe tried as best she could to set the scene in a kind of Savickas type manner. And it was quite clear this young woman was very, very disturbed. And you may be familiar with notions of disassociation, I'm sure you are, so that people tell a story, but the emotion is dead in relation to the story. So she was talking about disturbance and difficulty as though there was no emotional dimension. It was flat. It was monodimensional. And this is what we mean by disassociation. And this disturbed Zoe. And the thing that was important for her in the work context, and I know you struggle with this, I think, was no adequate supervision available. In fact, there was a real jumble in the supervision because supervision was mixed with management, which I think can be complicated, to put it mildly. And anyway, you were grabbing at 10 minutes when you needed to have more time just to sit down and say, well, I feel slightly troubled by this interaction. I'd just like to think about it with you and find a way forward. That really wasn't available. But Zoe did feel recognised. She felt recognised as part of the action research group, where she felt she was more able to talk openly and to tell stories about her experience. The relationship, and I said there are parallels between, if you like, the counselling relationship and the research relationship. The relationship with Hazel and me was very important. And she felt contained by that relationship. She loved the opportunity. And she said, you know, I'd never talk about this at work. It's just not possible because people feel so pressurized. She loved literature. And she was able to bring in literature to think about the experiences of some of her clients. That reminds me of. And just the permission almost to be able to do that was extraordinary. So she described the research project, for what it's worth, as a lifeline. I'm going to move on. Andrew and faith in the city. I've given you a very brief soundbite almost about this context. This hurts, actually. This is very personal for me, because this was a city once with a very proud economic tradition in potteries, mines, iron and steel production. And in the 80s, all of that went. There's still pottery made there, but from something like 100,000 people who were employed in the pottery industry in the 70s, it went down to 9,000. And that's a pretty catastrophic fall in the numbers of people employed. The estate where I was born, I was aware of problems. I heard that there'd been a fire at a nation shop. I'd heard that somebody had been killed. And I thought to myself, well, I do have certain kinds of experience and skills. I'm going to go spend some time just being ethnographically in this part of the city and just gathering people's stories. And that's what I did. That then took me into some Muslim communities in the city, and I did more or less the same thing. And that raised all sorts of issues as well about who I was, surveillance, and all the other things that may immediately come to mind. The estate, my estate, was unrecognised. Now I know there's a terrible tendency for what we call splitting in psychospeak. So that's where we idealise the past and we think of the present as all terrible. It's much more mixed than that. But in a sense, the extent of drug taking was considerable. Somebody said, look out of that house, this is somebody I'm talking to, the druggies are over there. And actually, this is where it gets very complicated. The British National Party, who made a lot of inroads on the estate, sorted out the druggies. So it's quite complicated. That's a kind of recognition. So recognition isn't all about goody things. It's about very complicated things too. Mental health. I don't entirely buy into the Layard-Clark research methodology that establishes numbers. But as a rough guide, we're talking about one out of 3 families with somebody with mental health issues. And that's enormous. That's difficult. That's going to disturb the professionals engaging with this. Racism and violence, the gangs on the estate, which I've been a kid on the estate. I've been part of a gang. We had fights, but this is on a mega scale. This was when I was little. And the violence on the streets, and the politics, because not only had the economy collapsed, but politics too. And here in this context was a priest called Andrew. He hated austerity. He felt some of the interventions that had been made in his community and in the city more widely had suddenly withered and died. You may recall the Pathfinder project. This was a housing redevelopment project. So in Stoke, what they did, they raised areas so as to prepare the areas for a major rebuilding program, except the second bit never took place. Because in 2010, whatever we think about it, a coalition government came in and the program was that caused huge anger and resentment in the city of Stoke. He felt that he was losing his way. We can think of him as a professional. He went to neighbourhood development meetings. There was a neighbourhood group trying to work towards regenerating the estate. He really struggled with other professionals. And he would come home and think, what is going on here? Are we just in competition with one another? How are we helping to improve the estate so that people might, relatively speaking, flourish? And this used to drive him mad. He also, interestingly, talked about his crisis of faith. So what was he supposed to be doing as a priest in that sort of context? And he had different voices, in object relations terms, I do, in his head, in his heart. So one voice, my religion is about coming alongside the widow, the poor, the oppressed. That's what it's fundamentally about. But he had other voices in his head about why can't people live a decent family life? And why are some of these families so dysfunctional? Why is there no respect for children in certain families or for partners and so on? He was struggling with all this. And we gave, so that it was almost as if me spending time with him, and some of this work was over 3 or even 4 years, working longitudinally. He talked about the research as a kind of therapy, which raises interesting issues. I don't have a problem with that, in the sense that I think listening, coming alongside non-judgmentally, giving someone a sense of legitimacy to share things which they may more regularly just close down on, that can be therapeutic. You need to understand boundary issues, of course you do, and you're not there as a therapist, but nonetheless just listening in that sort of qualitatively attuned way can be enormously therapeutic for people. How did he find relative degrees of flourishing in this kind of context? Food banks. And it was the development of the food banks which was partly ecumenical. So a number of religious groups were working to provide the food banks, but lots of other professionals coming in. And it was the sense of a common purpose, that they were doing something important, which so contrasted with the fractiousness and the rivalry in the neighbourhood project meetings. So that's Andrew's. So I want to finally sort of bring in Matthew. I walked around this place a moment ago and I saw there's lots of conferences here on migration. It's a massive issue for our time. And Matthew, this came out of research we were doing on non-traditional learners in universities. It was a European research project. And if we want to go into the heart of darkness, this is real heart of darkness stuff. Matthew was the product of the Civil War. He fled the country, eventually ended up here, ended up in London. He talked a lot about the racism and violence in particular communities. He talked about the madness. He was actually not a badly educated person. He spoke 4 languages, which becomes eventually quite important. But he ended up he was determined to enter higher education. He ended up in what we might call an elite university, where there was no personal tutor. The personal tutor was away for 12 months. Couldn't understand the rituals of this institution. The French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu talks of the habitus. And when you come from a particular background, you don't know what the hell is going on. You don't understand the rituals. You don't understand the way people talk. And Matthew had come from a quite different culture. He dropped out. He ended up in an access program in a local FE college. He was doing well, and then two of his teachers noticed that he was no longer there. What had happened to him? So they went in search of him and find out what had happened, because they had a real sense of a strong relationship with Matthew, who was been such a determined, even delightful student. They met him, they talked about it. You remember those vans in London that went round, inform on anybody who's here illegally? Do you remember those? Matthew had noticed those. And at roughly the same time, you remember that the asylum seekers had to report to an asylum centre more regularly. I think it was fortnightly or something like that. And that, of course, had affected his ability, as he saw it, to attend. He was feeling very fragile, very uncertain about what on earth to do. As it happened, the two lecturers were like good parents. I'm always interested in the way in which our role, in whatever context, will change and shift. One moment we're a lecturer, another moment we're a good parent. They organised a campaign for Matthew, and they started the process of asylum seeking. They also got him back in the course, because by the time we engaged with him, he was 1 year into a programme at another, yes, more multicultural university where he felt much more comfortable. We as researchers are very conscious about our role with Matthew. In many ways he was very competent, but he was constantly wanting our reassurance. Think of the primitive aspects here of who we are. Is this okay? Is this right? He was very anxious about his writing. And he kept on struggling with one or two assignments. One of them, this was debated last week from a colleague, can I send you something to look at? Ethical issues, what do we do? Anyway, we agreed and we kind of made comments on his writing. If he was offering something to us, why shouldn't we be offering something in return? Although we had a big ethical debate about that. Now, I posit the idea that in those interactions, as well as some of the other interactions I've been talking about, that there is a sense of quite fundamental recognition of selfhood having space to be expressed without being dismissed, or denounced, or judged in a negative way. At the second level of self-esteem, what Matthew did, and I want to put this to you as a possibility in your own professional and student lives, Matthew was actually quite opportunistic in finding groups to which he wanted to belong, and for which he found support. So he joined the University Equal Opportunities Committee, and he suddenly found himself representing all kinds of groups within the university and found himself, my God, not only am I becoming a student, but the Vice-Chancellor even listens to me. This is very much around the idea, I think, of self-respect. Later, Matthew, and I think the sense of being opportunistic, because you cannot rely on organisations to provide some of the good enough groups. We have to make these ourselves. We have to create them very frequently ourselves. Organisations won't do it for you. It's no good complaining to the Vice-Chancellor, why don't you do this or that or the other? We have to be agents, I think, both individually and collectively. Matthew also became a spokesperson. He had 4 languages, actually. English was his 4th language. And he was able, as it were, to act as an advocate for various groups in the university, but also outside the university, because his great interest was community health. He questioned the medical model of health, but tended to think of it as a kind of individualized thing when he wanted to bring in the frame issues to do with poverty and issues to do with the way particular people experience their relationship with others, particularly dominant others. So he became a wider advocate for, it's a word, I don't entirely like it, but more holistic approaches to community health than existed. And this gave him a sense of great self-esteem. And he was in the process of feeling valued, feeling important, feeling legitimate, feeling recognised. He was much more able to recognise diverse others in the university and also in the wider community. But all this, and that's why I've got there the final point, the violet, going back to the violet, it's very fragile. Things can change very rapidly. These aren't simple linear processes. This is not a journey to some kind of New Jerusalem, uncomplicated, far from it. Because you can face setbacks and difficulties. This is a struggle. We might call it a life-wide and lifelong struggle. So I'll shut up now in a minute, anyway, because I'd be fascinated in your responses to to Matthew, to Andrew, and to Zoe. I use the phrase projective identification, which is an important dynamic in psychodynamic understanding of the way human beings are with one another. I'm aware that for a range of reasons, in many different settings of mental health, in guidance and so on, the dominant zeitgeist might be about the importance of storytelling and giving space to people, but the context of work intensification and having rigidly defined outcomes is making some of this kind of stuff very difficult. So each of you in your own ways may be struggling with precisely the sorts of issues that Zoe did. I put it to you that if we, each of us, feels better recognised, we are better able to recognise others, and that should be considered an important part of our professional cultures, that we find spaces to recognise each other at those three different levels. It's all a very delicate flower. We have to be aware of that. We have to be aware of that. And what I've also suggested is, if you like, a psychosocial rather than a psychoanalytic or sociological perspective, because I think we need some understanding of people of the inner world, including ourselves. Self-knowledge seems to me to be important in this, but not to be frightened of having some theoretical friends. In my case, it's people I mentioned. It's Donald Winnicott, Axel Honneth, John Dewey, to come alongside and to help us in our journey, to help us make sense of something. Theory may have an uncomfortable place in the stories we tell ourselves, but actually it's incredibly important. And the role of the university in this, which is my closing point. What is the role of the university? What is the role of this kind of organisation in doing some of this work? In the building of recognition so that people can feel more able, more confident, more okay enough with themselves to engage with some of the difficult work that's an inevitable part of 21st century societies and cultures. I'll stop there. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Linden. So rich and so much for us to think about beginning our day where we're going on to workshops, so we'll have specific things to think about.
Can I just mention this,
yes.
the reading list, which I don't know whether you...
Which you must all read by the next...
in 10 minutes.
In 10 minutes.
I sent out, I don't know whether you sent out the earlier...
No, but we will.
Yeah, okay. It's just I missed out one or two readings that maybe speak to you directly, particularly work I did with Hazel.
Brilliant. Thank you.